Theresa May's government will unveil its plan on Tuesday for new customs arrangements with the European Union after Brexit, the first part of a concerted attempt by ministers this week to change the narrative around their handling of Britain's withdrawal by laying out more detailed plans. The UK will seek a temporary extension of the current customs arrangements to avoid disrupting trade, in what will be seen as a victory for proponents of a softer Brexit. It would mean that Britain can't bring new trade deals with non-EU countries into effect for several years after leaving the bloc, a development that will be deeply unpopular with Leave supporters. In the document, the government will confirm that Britain will formally leave the EU's customs union when it leaves the EU in March 2019, despite business lobbyists and opposition MPs arguing that Britain would be economically better off if it stays in the customs union after Brexit. May declared in a landmark speech in January, when she first set out her vision for Brexit, that Britain will have to leave the EU single market and customs union in March 2019, and this remains government policy. But the UK will ask the EU to agree to a temporary customs union that would effectively prolong much of the status quo for a limited period of time, so that trade between the UK and the other member states can continue with as little disruption as possible until a new British customs regime is fully in place, DexU said on Monday night. The details of these transitional arrangements are to be negotiated. The position paper is the first of several this week intended by UK ministers to show their counterparts in Brussels that they are making progress, and to reassure big companies with investments in the UK that there are plans in place to avoid a catastrophic economic jolt when Britain leaves in 2019, according to limited information provided by DexU to journalists ahead of the publication. One future scenario being considered would involve the UK and the EU entering a partnership aligning their customs approaches. Under this option, the EU and the UK would apply the same rules and tariffs on imports and exports between member states, and on goods transients between member states, including on those originating in the UK. BuzzFeed News understands that the partnership would closely mirror current arrangements. However, as a third country, Britain would be free to set its own tariffs and standards for exports outside the EU. Another proposal the UK is putting forward would create a new customs border with the EU after the interim phase, while streamlining and simplifying requirements to the fullest extent possible through negotiated and unilateral facilitations which reduce and remove barriers to trade, according to DexU. In recent weeks, the government has been accused of being underprepared for the monumental negotiations. The general election severely undermined May's authority and cast into doubt whether the Prime Minister's hard vision for Brexit would remain the government's approach. A series of apparently contradictory statements by ministers left the impression that her cabinet is deeply divided about what to do. The sense of unreadiness reached its peak when David Davis, the Brexit secretary, was photographed at the start of the latest round of negotiations, in mid-July, without any documents in front of him, in contrast to his seemingly well-prepared counterparts. In Brussels, European politicians are said to be so flummoxed by the UK's lack of preparedness that some figure it has to be trap, according to a recent story in Politico. Eager to take back control of the narrative, the UK says it will publish several position papers this week about the future relationship with the EU, giving clarity about its position on several important aspects of the negotiations. Chris Leslie, the Labour MP who supports remaining in the EU, said the government was still trying to have its cake and eat it, by claiming that it can have frictionless trade with EU states while being outside the customs union. The paper on the customs union will be followed by another on Wednesday setting out the UK's views on the dilemma of the Irish border. May is still on holiday in Europe until later in the week, but her government is desperate to show that it has a handle on Brexit ahead of the next round of talks with the European Commission later in the month. May's broad approach to Brexit has been clear since her speech at Lancaster House in January, but a lack of specific detail, along with the apparent disagreement among cabinet ministers on opposite sides of the Brexit debate, has led many to question whether the UK is as prepared as it needs to be for such a monumental negotiation. A huge body of work has been undertaken across government since last summer, the Department for Exiting the European Union DexU said in a statement late on Monday night. By showing the results of some of that work in the next few days, the government hopes to quieten its critics, give assurance to various groups making competing demands, and accelerate progress in the Brexit talks. The government is caught in a tricky position, politically, between satisfying the demands of those who voted leave in the expectation that the UK would take back control of its legal and economic affairs on day one, and those who believe the status quo will have to be extended for several years to avoid an economically catastrophic jolt. The political bind will be evident in Tuesday's paper on the customs union. At one level, withdrawal from the customs union will be portrayed as a great opportunity for Britain to increase its prosperity by forging new trade links with countries outside Europe. Dig into the detail, though, and the complexity is quickly apparent. Adopting a short-term compromise would mean British importers and exports aren't hit by a sudden change that would badly damage their businesses. Meanwhile, UK authorities would have more time to carry out the complicated, technical work of implementing a wholly new customs system. At the same time, the UK would be formally out of the EU's customs union, so it would be free to start negotiating its own trade deals with countries like the United States and Australia. One of the main opportunities for the UK are after leaving the bloc, according to Brexit campaigners. Under the EU's customs arrangements, all members apply the same standards and tariffs to imports and exports, and trade deals with non-EU countries are negotiated not by individual governments but centrally by officials in Brussels. It is unclear how the UK hopes to handle during its role in the dozens of trade deals the EU has in place with countries around the world, such as the recently concluded deal agreement with Canada. Leaving the Union will allow the UK to pursue a trade policy that will make it stronger, fairer, more prosperous and more outward-looking, by tapping into markets beyond Europe, Dexu said. At the same time, the government insists it will still be able to have frictionless trade with the EU from outside the Union, an assertion that has been contradicted by Europe's top negotiator, Michel Barnier. There's a catch: although the UK would be able to negotiate and sign its own trade deals, they would not actually come into force until the temporary transition period is over and Britain has its own fully functioning customs regime. Both the interim and new customs arrangement will have to be approved by the other 27 EU member states. The UK did not say how long it hopes the temporary transition period will last. Tom Brake, the Liberal Democrats' Brexit spokesman, said the interim arrangement would only temporarily delay the disruption of withdrawing from the customs union. The Lib Dems have campaigned to stay in the single market and customs union. We still face the prospect of more red tape for businesses, longer queues at our borders and higher prices for consumers once the transition comes to an end, Brake said. Josh Hardy, Deputy Director General of the CBI, the business lobby group, said companies would welcome more clarity from the government. But the clock is ticking and what matters now is giving companies the confidence to continue investing as quickly as possible, he added. British ministers are keen to move beyond the first stage of talks and to start discussing the UK's long-term economic relationship, which they envision will be underpinned by a sweeping free trade deal. The EU has different priorities. The Commission insists that Britain will have to resolve the terms of its withdrawal, including a divorce bill to resolve its financial commitments, the rights of expats, and the status of the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, before the talks can progress to transitional arrangements or a long-term relationship. The UK's thinking is that the customs arrangements need to be established to resolve the Irish border question. The other 27 EU members have yet to set out their thinking on customs arrangements or any other matters beyond the first phase. For now, Barnier's top priority is money. The last time European and British negotiators met in Brussels, he said the UK needed to clarify its intentions on the exit payment. It's not clear whether the UK plans to publish a position paper on the financial settlement before the two sides meet again at the end of the month. Privately, senior Whitehall officials have said the UK will end up paying between £30 billion and £50 billion, but the Brexit minister David Davis has reportedly said the exit bill is off the table until Brussels agrees to a trade deal.